Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning and welcome to this CSIS gathering today, the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. I'm Stephen Morrison, Senior Vice President here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, where I direct our Global Health Policy Center. And we've been very active with our colleagues like Jake Kurtzer, who's organized this event and will speak momentarily. We've been very active on Ukraine in the lead up and during this first month of the crisis. We've put out 2 short videos, Ukraine, the Human Price of War, and we'll be releasing a 3rd end of next week. I'd encourage you to look at those if you can. Many thanks to Jake for pulling us all together, and many thanks to our esteemed panelists. Jake will be introducing them momentarily, and a special thanks also to the team that put this all together at CSIS. Eric Roditsky, particularly on the production side, along with Mary Wright, Harim Abdullah, and Rick Leonard from the humanitarian program. We lost Madeleine Albright yesterday, a very sad moment, but the timing was quite remarkable, really. On the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, on February 23rd, Madeleine Albright wrote a very prescient and powerful op-ed in the New York Times that, if you go back and read it today, it's kind of remarkable at what it foretold. In it, she wrote of her first meeting 23 years ago with Putin, in which she, in her notes, had scribbled that he was small and pale, so cold as to be almost reptilian. And she cautioned Putin in that editorial that should he invade, it will be a historic error. She passed yesterday on the eve of the United States government declaring that it has evidence the Russian military has committed war crimes in Ukraine. That statement, which reveals the moral leadership that Madeleine Albright brought to the United States decades past during the Balkan Wars and beyond, that combined with President Biden's own declaration that Putin is a war criminal and similar statements by other leaders puts Putin now in a box. In just scarcely 4 weeks, he's established his status as a new Stalin, a new Milosevic. And I don't believe there's any walking back from that. It poses all sorts of complications and dilemmas, but it's a reality and a well-deserved one. Today marks the beginning of the 2nd month of war amid vast uncertainty and dread. And as we'll hear from our speakers, the complexities and challenges facing the humanitarian community, the humanitarian world inside Ukraine and those outside attempting to assist are monumentally complex and facing a monumental scale of demands. What have we seen in the first month? We've seen systematic military terror turned against civilians and civilian infrastructure escalating at an astonishing rate, as the ground war has failed up to this point in also an astonishing way. A quarter of the population is uprooted, over 3.5 million refugees, 12 million additional civilians that are in peril. That means half of Ukraine's population has been thrown into high risk and trauma in just 4 weeks. Mariupol has been established as the icon of barbarianism of this era, revealing what many of us had predicted, which was the Russian playbook developed in Grozny and in Chechnya over a 10-year period and in Syria since 2015 is informing actions against society, the innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure. Mariupol is now standing shoulder by shoulder with Stalingrad, with Dresden, with Grozny, with Aleppo. We have the iconic attack upon the maternity hospital, upon the theater, and the like. And now the question of what next? What additional icons will we see looking forward? We've seen a decline, and we'll hear more from our expert panel. We're seeing a decline of access and security of humanitarian operations. And people are pondering, okay, what next? What comes next? I mentioned earlier, for humanitarians, this is a period of extraordinarily complicated challenges of a scale that is really quite unfathomable in some ways. What are we facing? We don't know. We're facing perhaps an escalation and widening of the war and an extension into the neighboring territories, our NATO allies. We're facing the possibility of a contained war, but a long and grinding one that could go on for months or years. Perhaps we'll see a hurting stalemate emerge at some point that produces ceasefires and negotiations that could stretch out for a long time. Perhaps we'll see an internal process within Russia lead to a change of regime as society and the economy and in Russia collapse and become hollowed out. We have to ask ourselves what this may mean in terms of escalation. Will we see attacks along the corridors where you have refugees moving east and you have both humanitarian assistance and security assistance flowing west? Will we see a widening into the west, into the redoubt of around Lviv? We've seen 2 missile launches into that area, one a hypersonic vehicle. Will we see the war extend cross-border and begin to threaten the operational centers for humanitarians as well as for those organizing the security assistance? We know today, as President Biden is speaking at NATO and in 2 other fora, at the EU and the G7, a kind of trifecta of diplomacy, we'll see a discussion of the air war. We'll see a discussion of the chem, bio, and nuclear threats that lie on the margins. As Putin becomes more desperate, does he turn to those? Final thoughts: the line between humanitarian and military assistance is not a very clean or clear line. The line between intervention and non-intervention is not a very clean or clear line. This is the world and this is the war that Ukrainians are living in, and this is the world and the war in which humanitarians, both those internal and those external, struggling to meet the needs of an escalating demand among Ukrainian civilians. Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here with you today. Special thanks to Jake for his exceptional leadership on these issues in leading the humanitarian agenda. He's done a remarkable job at creating a community of experts like those we're seeing here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve, for your comments and for the work your team and the Global Health Commission at CSIS has undertaken, in particular to highlight the devastating impacts of armed conflict on medical care in situations of armed conflict. It's truly devastating to see the way that these patterns keep replicating. I want to just now move quickly over to our panelists. We're going to start today with Alex Mahoney, the Acting Office Director for the Middle East at the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at USAID and lead for the Ukraine response. Alex, can you just, for our viewers today, run us through the top lines of the United States government's response to the humanitarian impacts of this conflict so far?
Sure, and thank you. Just to start out, so as you've already heard, today is the 1-month anniversary of the start of this war. And if you think about the humanitarian impacts, you start to get an understanding of how catastrophic this has been. 6.5 million people are displaced within Ukraine today, as well as 3.5 million people that have been driven across Ukraine's border. And that is just staggering in a month's time for that many people, in terms of the amount of suffering, in terms of lives uprooted. So from a humanitarian perspective, that is what we are contending with and trying to address. We've heard distressing reports from partners in cities like Mariupol, where people are living in terrible conditions. They lack safe drinking water, which is essential to to life. They lack food, fuel, and electricity, and they are trapped. The damage that you're seeing is people are living through that, unable to get out and unable to receive the basic necessities of life. So before the invasion even began, we were preparing for this. We could see what was coming based on the troop buildup on the borders of Ukraine. And so we deployed a disaster assistance response team, a DART. That is our tool for managing emergency humanitarian responses around the world. That team is up to 25 people. We have staff in Poland, in Hungary, Moldova, Romania, and Slovakia. And they are leading the US government's humanitarian response, coordinating our aid and identifying needs and working with the partners that we are supporting for aid to go into Ukraine. The humanitarian assistance we are providing includes food, it includes safe drinking water, shelter support, emergency health care, and household supplies for people who are displaced and in need, as well as vulnerable groups still living in place. And we are coordinating with the greater humanitarian community. That includes other donors that are supporting this response, such as the European Union and others, to make sure that aid is maximized and effective. We actually, as USAID, had supported humanitarian assistance in Ukraine since 2014, since the initial Russian aggression in the eastern part of the country. So we had a base of partners to work with in Ukraine to expand the response. And as of today, I can also say that the White House has announced that the U.S. is prepared to provide up to $1 billion in humanitarian assistance. So that is the scale of what we are looking at in terms of aid provision. But aid to date, it has included the categories I talked about and some more specific examples of what we're doing. It includes plane loads of more than 400 metric tons of life-saving supplies that we have in our own warehouses around the world, as well as funding organizations to procure and transport their own supplies. So, for example, we're supporting the World Food Program, which is aiming to reach 3.1 million people inside Ukraine, and with our support, they've provided nearly 900 metric tons of assistance to date, which is enough for 330,000 people. We're also continuing to provide critical psychosocial support to children, to people with disabilities, and older people. We're supporting mobile medical units for trauma and emergency healthcare. We are supporting UNICEF to provide safe drinking water, as well as mobile teams to help people with psychosocial support, case management, as well as other risks, including gender-based violence. And we're supporting the World Health Organization with emergency health kits, which again are to provide very basic, critical healthcare needs for hundreds of thousands of people. I have to say that despite all of these efforts, the situation on the ground is still getting worse. The awful thing about those numbers that we've talked about is that the Russia's war is not ending. They actually seem to be becoming more and more aggressive, and so we are seeing the crisis grow daily in terms of numbers in need. Another challenge that we are facing is access. With ongoing violence, it is very hard to reach people, and it is also hard for people to get out. The other thing I wanted to mention quickly is that we're seeing an incredible groundswell of interest from people around the United States and around the world that want to help out. One thing that we advocate very strongly is that the best way to help is through cash donations. We've from decades of experience in working in disaster relief and recovery, cash donations are really the most effective way to help the organizations in Ukraine get what they need and provide people the support they need as quickly as possible. So that is really important. And we work with a partner called the Center for International Disaster Information. They have a website which I will post in the chat, which is really useful for understanding who's working in Ukraine and how best to help them. And I think I'll stop there for any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex, and for the work that you and your colleagues in the DART are doing and throughout BHA and the U.S. government. I mean, we've seen really an incredibly fast mobilization, and that's what DARTs do. That's what BHA does, but it has been impressive to see the amount of money. I wanted to ask you two very brief follow-up questions before letting you get back to your work. You talked about cash from people around the United States who want to contribute, but we also know that Administrator Power has made localization of a humanitarian response a priority, and that cash is often seen as direct cash assistance is often seen as one of the best interventions humanitarians can provide for people in need. Are you able to speak a little bit to the breakdown of, to what extent, at least in the neighboring countries, but at least in parts of Ukraine that are still controlled by the Ukrainian authorities, that USAID and the other donor partners are able to support, local civil society organizations as well as the traditional partners like UNICEF and the others?
Yeah, certainly. So I mentioned earlier that we've been working in Ukraine since 2014, and USAID as an agency has had partners and programs all over Ukraine, including local partners. And quite frankly, we could not respond effectively without local partners. Ukrainians understand their country best. They understand the needs in the country best. So this is a philosophy that we apply all over the world in disaster response, but especially in Ukraine, where we have these existing networks and connections. This is really critical. So this is the bedrock of our response. And even when I talk about international organizations like UNICEF and the World Food Program and WHO, they too are working through local organizations, volunteer-based organizations, as well as Ukrainian government at multiple levels. And as far as cash goes, it is still possible to procure things for emergency relief inside Ukraine. And that's really important because it helps local organizations, it helps the local economy, and it is the fastest way to reach people. And in neighboring countries as well, there are functioning markets, and almost everything that is needed can be obtained either within Ukraine or in those neighboring countries. So yes, we are focused very strongly on localization for Ukraine.
Thanks so much, Alex, and we really appreciate it and your time today. And we'll let you get back to it, but it is encouraging to hear that we have that lens. I mean, the scale is so big that it would be easy to fall into patterns, but it really is important and crucial, I think, especially for the rebuilding effort, to make sure that the civil society organizations in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries are really at the forefront of the response. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we wish you and your colleagues the best of luck. We'll turn now to our panel. We're very grateful to be joined today by Maggie Fleming, Director for Humanitarian Practice at Interaction, the coalition of voluntary US-based non-governmental organizations, Ms. Lauren Pucci, the Senior Director for Emergency and Humanitarian Programs at HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and Dr. Charlie Carpenter, Director of the Human Security Lab and Professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a senior fellow at the Belfar Center at Harvard. Thank you to the three of you for joining us. Maggie, I'd like to start with you. You're representing the NGO community in Washington, and can you share a little bit what the main concerns that have been expressed by Interaction members regarding humanitarian access in this contested space? What barriers are standing in the way, and how can the stakeholders work collectively to overcome some of these challenges to have a meaningful response?
Sure, thanks, Jake. So I want to thank CSIS really quickly for putting this together. As it's been said, it's extremely timely and important. With regards to the question, I want to bring 3 points to it, but I also want to take a view that is less micro, but I'll get there. So talking about some of the bigger obstacles that are further conflating, which has been talked about, and just how complex. The first one is, and it has been said, recognizing that the humanitarian limitations are quite challenging in this crisis. I think it's worth saying again that this was first and foremost a geopolitical crisis, and it has massive humanitarian consequences. That humanitarians, even as much as we are working with partners like BHA and others, we will not be the fix. We will not have all of those answers and solutions. We will not be able to fill all of those gaps. But the second point on the complexities is around providing principled, and I want to underscore principled humanitarian assistance in this environment. Remembering as well that humanitarians on the ground are there for the Ukrainian people, the people who are caught in the middle of this. And it gets a little conflated because a number of our donors are also supporting the government. And now the government has been pulled into this as a party to the conflict. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but one of the key principles around humanitarian aid is trying to keep our neutrality and partiality. And it was said, I think earlier by Stephen, is that there are blurred lines between military assistance and humanitarian assistance. And I think it's extremely important to make sure that those lines stay very separate and distinguished. One of the further complexities that Alex actually spoke to is that humanitarian development and governance work in Ukraine has previously been staffed and carried out by the Ukrainian people. These are the same people who have been massively impacted by this, who have either had to flee, are now engaged in the conflict, either by force or through conscription or volunteer. But much of this humanitarian response inside Ukraine in the last month is almost like a new footprint. There are still local partners on the ground who are able to move things forward, and a number of international INGOs, some who were there, but some who now have a presence there, are working through them. But you've got to remember, they're all being impacted by this. So trying to deal with hiring local staff and then working around conscription, trying to remain that, have that humanitarian principled response to scale. We're seeing that these are proving to be extremely difficult challenges to navigate for actors inside. And lastly, this is not, I'm going to bring this all back, I promise, but this is not directly in line with your question, but I think that this is a bigger concern of the community as well, and it warrants being said, is that the consequences that we're going to see from this crisis go beyond the borders of Ukraine and they go beyond the region. And I'm specifically speaking to the global food market and the food security repercussions that we are going to see from this. Ukraine and Russia make up 1/3 of the global cereal exports. And there are 50 countries alone who depend on their wheat just from Russia and Ukraine. So this is going to have this is a massive concern of the community, and it's going to have, a global fallout on food security in general. But circling back to your question, so we're dealing with some of these bigger issues, but they're also, this is a very mobile and fluid response. It has been said again and again that there is not one single location inside of Ukraine that is considered safe. I think Stephen pointed out that Lviv has been, hit by a rocket twice now. So it's the access is an issue, and they are going further and further inside, but also dealing with some of these larger issues that kind of hang over them from the humanitarian side. It's proving to be an extremely complex crisis to try and navigate to scale in such a quick and fast response.
Thanks very much, Maggie. We'll come back to some of the complexities when we come back to you, but I want to turn to you, Lauren. HIAS has had a partnership with Right to Protection, a Ukrainian-based NGO that has been working, since I guess 2001 on behalf of asylum seekers and displaced. So, can you talk a little bit about HIAS's work so far? How is HIAS working with R2P on the ground? And what are the immediate priorities for your organization and your partner organization with respect to both humanitarian assistance response, but also questions of civilian protection?
Thank you, Jacob, and thanks all to the panel and also providing this opportunity here today. I think it's very timely, given that we're hitting the 1 month mark of this conflict. So really pleased to be drawing attention to the conflict, what we're seeing on the ground. I think I will respond to those questions, and then I do want to build off of some of the comments that were made by Maggie and Alex both. I think that there's some things very applicable to what we're seeing through our work with R2P. So for everyone not familiar with HIAS, we're an international Jewish humanitarian organization. And in 2001, we established an office in Kiev, operating as HIAS Ukraine. And at that time, we were working with Ukrainian Jews and other religious minorities seeking asylum, helping them with resettlement. And in 2014, HIAS helped to establish Right to Protection, now known as R2P. So they've been operating as an independent Ukrainian NGO, primarily looking at what has been happening from the previous conflict that we saw in Ukraine. And their primary role has been to provide legal and humanitarian aid assistance to internally displaced persons, IDPs, from Eastern Ukraine. Until the current invasion, R2P had 10 offices across the country, 160 staff, 85 of whom were based in the East. So that includes Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and East Oblasts. And I do want to highlight, because Mariupol has come up several times in the opening comments here, and I think something I'll be highlighting throughout as I talk is really the psychological toll that's being taken on these frontline responders. 15 staff members from R2P are currently within Mariupol. No contact has been made with them. And so when you are working with an organization that's actively responding and your colleagues are within a besieged location, I think it puts it in perspective as far as what they are, dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So, and also on that note, 3.5 million people have fled across borders. We've heard the numbers, but I think just putting that in perspective, that is essentially the population of Los Angeles that has fled within 4 weeks' time, which is just astounding. And I think building on what Maggie mentioned as far as, the humanitarian response, moving into how we are, quickly responding to this, the best description that was given to me when I recently visited Lviv was, this essentially is open heart surgery, attempting to do it with a fork and toothpick. And I think that has improved, but I think it's just giving a really good image as to some of the very real realities that we're faced with on the ground. As far as with HIAS and R2P's response to date, we had started doing contingency planning with R2P even prior to the 24th, the start of the conflict on February 24th. We were actually supposed to be in Kiev that week doing some more mapping and contingency planning, and then we went into the response mode. So we were able to pre-position some financial reserves where we were able to transfer them quickly over to R2P for their evacuation, starting first in the east. And then once it hit Kiev, staff quickly relocated out to Lviv in the west. And so with Lviv, as Maggie mentioned, that's become more or less the center for humanitarian operations. But that was a town of 700,000. And recently, the latest toll number I've seen is 400,000 IDPs have come into Lviv. And so when you look at that compressed amount of individuals inside of Lviv, shelter becomes a big issue. Every bed that is taken by a humanitarian at this stage, a journalist, anyone coming in external, is a bed taken from an IDP or a refugee that will be crossing borders. And that is a very real a need that we're seeing as a top priority. For how R2P is responding to this and what HIAS is doing to work with them on this is that we are scaling up their cash-based assistance. I think in addition to the sheltering pieces, rental prices are skyrocketing. When you have a shortage in supply, that's a natural trajectory. So we're working to have more availability of doing cash. Also looking to scale up, and we've already been able to increase the capacity to provide mental health psychosocial support services, not only to Ukrainians, potential asylum seekers, potential refugees, but also to responders themselves. And I think that that's something that being mindful, I think Alex's comments earlier, as far as saying cash-based assistance being the most appropriate response, when untrained responders come in that aren't able to handle the emotional toll of war and what they're seeing, they oftentimes will take on a vicarious trauma, and they need coping mechanisms themselves. So it becomes a compounding problem. So that's something that we're working with staff right now to build up. And then over time, and highlighting R2P, one of the most immediate services that they're providing right now, and they were able to quickly mobilize on, is they operate a hotline within the country, and it's local. It's advertised on local media. Individuals are able to call in and get support for if it's legal referral information, evacuation routes, services that are available. And so when we took a stock as far as the numbers calling in, it was the evacuation services that was the number one ask. In addition to that, R2P, through another partner, has been providing non-food item assistance within Dnipro. So as part of that supply chain that Alex referenced earlier, they were part of that as far as being on the ground, able to get it out there. And one of the positives, because you always have to look for a positive that has come out of this experience, is that R2P has gained, in a very short amount of time, some logistical capacity and expertise in that regard that we're looking to scale up and be able to take on even more. They basically flipped into motion there. And I also want to take note that HIAS beyond inside of Ukraine itself, we also are responding external as well. This is not just inside of Ukraine, it's on the borders. We are increasing our presence within Poland, already working with partners to provide cash for rent, working with a partnership with Airbnb to identify locations for refugees to stay. And we will increase our presence and look to build that out, as well as wider communities as well. I do want to close with one comment, because I think that this is, goes with the localization piece and working with local partners. When I checked in with R2P prior to this panel, I asked what's the big thing that we want everyone to know? And what they came back with, and it's something that I observed as well previously, is that for humanitarian workers in Ukraine, there is a humanitarian exemption for conscription that is to be in place. For implementing partners, those of UN agencies or those, it is a hit or miss if that exemption takes place. And so this is something with R2P, 6 staff members have been conscripted. All males are registered, and that is very real potential. And so we are advocating to try to get this, more attention on this, because it is a very real reality. And if your first frontline responders are those who are being conscripted and taken off the front lines, it begs the question, how are we going to carry out this response? And I'll close there.
Thanks very much. There's a lot to unpack there. I want to just turn now to Dr. Carpenter. You're both an academic, but also have served in humanitarian action and were reporting and assisting with relief efforts on the Polish side of the Polish-Ukraine border. And I'm wondering if you could share with us some of your observations. What are the main concerns that you've heard from people when you were there from Ukrainians fleeing the conflict? And what are the biggest challenges? Lauren mentioned the neighboring countries and areas of work. What are the biggest challenges in Poland for communities receiving them and seeking to help? I didn't just unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Jake, and thanks for having me here. I just returned. I won't speak for all Ukrainian refugees, but I will tell you that those I interacted with, first and foremost, their big concern is to be able to return home. Displacement itself is traumatic. One of the most disturbing things I heard while I was there is that some refugees who have come over are already so despondent in flight that they now want to go back, even though the war is still raging. But what they really want is to go back in safety to a country that isn't completely destroyed. And to achieve this, their biggest concern is, frankly, to get some support from the West in their war against Russia, not just economic sanctions and not just sort of performative support, thoughts and prayers, and humanitarian aid, but really military support to win the war. And they want it fast before there's nothing left to return to. But secondly, for as long as the war is continuing, obviously many of these families prefer to flee than to stay, but they want the ability to flee, A, safely, and B, with their loved ones. And I'll just speak to each of these 2 points in turn. Refugees don't feel safe they don't feel safe anyway, but they don't feel safe when they arrive at a border with a badly coordinated effort being mostly run by kind-hearted strangers. And that is because if you're a refugee family without your male family members and your grandmother and a bunch of children in tow and some suitcases, you can't easily distinguish between the kind-hearted strangers and the other strangers that will traffic you into more unsavory situations. So what they want to see is some government organization, government buses, recognizable professional organizations, coordinating volunteers, authorities to assist them in navigating the incredible challenges of the asylum process. And at least at parts of the border that I visited, these kinds of resources are really scant. Everything, rides, supplies, information, it's all being crowdsourced and crowdfunded through networks, which you hope you can trust, but you don't really know who you're getting information from. It's extremely confusing, disorienting, stressful, and hazardous for the refugees. And bear in mind that most of these refugees coming over are women and children, and they are at even greater risk because of the absence of their male family members for support and protection, because they've been forced to abandon these loved ones in order to escape. Brothers, fathers, uncles, older sons are not permitted out. I transported one woman across the border who was 9 months pregnant, about to give birth. She had come all by herself, just with a tiny little suitcase. And she had left her husband behind, but she had also left her 4-year-old son behind, because she didn't think that alone, so pregnant, she could actually manage to care for her 4-year-old in flight. So because the father couldn't leave, the son is also trapped back in the war zone. And of course, she prefers they both be with her. But, and this family is now facing agonizing decisions now that they've been separated in this way. But I think it's really important to note that the decision of Western countries not to support Ukraine by sending trained troops to assist has contributed to a context in which the Ukrainian government is desperate to hold civilian men back. And this not only denies them their right to flee, but it's terrible for families who are kept safer in flight when they're together. So these are some of the concerns I was hearing from refugees that I encountered. What do Polish citizens want? Well, again, just sharing what I heard from those to whom I spoke, a self-selected sample. They are tired. The citizens that have been doing the refugees standing up this relief effort really feel they need help from governments and well-funded aid organizations and donor agencies to pick up the slack. This incredible Dunkirk moment we've been seeing is inspiring, but it's completely unsustainable. Local families have been taking in refugees, driving them, feeding them for weeks now, but they have jobs and demands on their time and limited resources. And even yesterday, it was reported that only this week, the Polish government has made approximately 2.3 million euros available to, I think, 43 small Polish NGOs for relief work. Think about that. 2.3 million euros for 3 million refugees. It's grossly insufficient. So what I was hearing from these Polish citizens and small NGOs is quite a bit of resentment, frankly, of their government for taking the credit for this grassroots humanitarian response without supplying much in the way of support. And bear in mind, these are also the same human rights activists and civil society organizations who have actually been hounded by the Polish government for years for the work they've done on the Belarus border, trying to assist Syrian refugees coming over. So they need respect, they need resources, and individual citizens especially are tired and need support. I want to say this doesn't just go for the Polish government, but also for other nations that are party to the UN Refugee Convention. EU countries, for example, have, I think, quite appropriately opened their doors, but the US continues to maintain significant barriers to refugees applying for asylum here. I know families who have fled with nothing and who want to join their relatives here in the US, but who are stuck in Poland instead, outwaiting a laborious legal process. And Poles want other Western countries to step up and receive these refugees who pass through Poland so that the flows into their own country and the numbers who stay in their own country remain manageable. So there's that. Finally, Polish citizens I spoke to, not necessarily the ones who are handling the relief effort, but just ordinary Poles I spoke to in bars and coffee shops after hours, they want protection. They see what is happening and they are terrified that Poland is going to be next, and that when that moment comes, the West will find another excuse to stand by. And they pointed to the precedent of World War II, and they also encouraged the US and NATO to take a much firmer stance toward Russia now before the war widens, when it will be more difficult. So that's some of what I was hearing when I was abroad.
Thanks for those reflections. I mean, there's so much to talk about, and I think this point about the citizens who have mobilized but have not yet felt the support from their government, and by extension, the European and US and other donor governments who can support the Polish government in supporting its own citizens, I think is a really important point when we think about what are the next steps and how do we make sure that this resentment doesn't increase and doesn't lead to negative outcomes for those people displaced by conflict. I want to come back to you, Lauren. I want to pick up on something you talked about, which is, the scale of the invasion on the 24th is of, degrees substantially greater, but we know that the Russian aggression in Ukraine did not start on February 24th, but goes back quite a long way. And you talked a little bit about work that that HIAS and R2P have done since 2014 in some of the areas already impacted by conflict. Are there any lessons that you can take away from working in near or around contested spaces since 2014 that can be applied in today's evolving humanitarian situation throughout Ukraine? And what steps do you take to reach some of the most vulnerable populations in places like Mariupol or elsewhere that might be just a little bit harder to reach because of security and other considerations?
No, great question, Jacob. I think for some of the lessons learned, I think that, nobody saw what was coming in this case at the scale that we're looking at. So there are some lessons learned we can extract from, but this has been, because it's the whole of the country at this point involved. But as far as the work that R2P has been involved with, as far as having those office locations in the East, a lot of it for asylum seekers that were coming through, legal services coming through the offices, that we would oftentimes do the referrals into the Kiev office onwards. When there was the planning that was taking place, some of the lessons learned that we had was to ensure to have the contingencies already set forth. So this had been already in process with R2P. They were already looking at it as if the first line were to go, it would likely be the East. And so that essentially our contingency plan followed suit up until it hit Kiev. And then at that point, we realized it was just, we've exceeded all contingency that was in place, similar to the rest of the humanitarian community. As far as some lessons learned, as the way that R2P operates in these areas is they do take extra precaution as far as their locations, where they're operating. And so this has been somewhat of a challenge. There's a lot of desire for coordination. We understand that. And so we do want to be transparent, but As far as where the actual locations of staff are operating, particularly for protection monitoring, it's something that we are very sensitive about. And I think that that's just the added layer of precaution that's added in there. RTP is, and this goes back to the idea of local networks, local responders, their extensive network on the ground. And this doesn't need to be a large INGO. It doesn't need to be an established local NGO. Having those grassroots networks into the communities is the way that they have operated. And it's one of the reasons why the hotline has been so successful as well, is that we do have the access to those communities. And so these are, it's a mix of lessons to learn. But I think one thing is that we were well prepared for needing to regroup, because we were not sure how far the Russian hostilities will go.
Yeah, I was thinking at the onset of this crisis, coming 6 months after the onset of a different humanitarian emergency that was in many ways widely predictable in Afghanistan, that the language of anticipatory action and preparation probably needs to evolve just from thinking about climate disasters to also thinking about predictable, political disasters. And so it's nice to know that, I don't, like you say, we could not have anticipated. Well, we could have, because there were so many troops there, but the scope and scale has gone beyond anyone's imaginations, and it's hard to plan for something of this magnitude. But it's important to know that some of that contingency planning was happening, and I think Alex referenced it as well in BHA's own preparations. You talked a little bit about the protection concerns, and I want to come back to you, Maggie, on the issue of the protection of the civilian population. I mean, the basic need for protection is protection from attack. And we've seen in Mariupol and in other cities under siege, indiscriminate attacks and bombings of civilian infrastructure. And there's been discussion around this concept of humanitarian corridors. But we also know from years of evidence that Russia doesn't respect principles of civilian protection. They don't respect the idea of safe passage. And so from the NGO community, what steps should we be thinking about to ensure safe passage, either for people wanting to flee, but also for humanitarian goods and services? How do we ensure that the material that needs to come in, what should we be talking about? What should we be thinking about in terms of safe passage for humanitarian action?
I mean, there are negotiations happening with Moscow around this, specifically around safe passage, around the humanitarian network system that is not fully up and going just yet. Negotiations but like as you said, Jake, they haven't respected this previously. How do we know that they'll do this again? I think that's one of the reasons this response, more so than a number of others that I've seen, is so fluid. You're not necessarily seeing actors go in and saying, okay, here will be our main base, and then we'll work out of here. They're saying, we'll go into 3-4 different locations, and we will be very mobile. I think there's a lot of concern inside, even for just the humanitarians, with regards to sharing where they are and what they're doing. And I know that there's been a big push on, can we get the 3 W's out? Can we share that with the government? Can we share that with the donors? So it's not a clear cut action. I think it has to, unfortunately, there will continue to be political negotiations around this with regards to safe passage. I know that one thing that I do want to say, and this is not popular, is that everything also is coming in from the western border. We are not trying to do cross-border. We are not having necessarily those negotiations to come in from the Russian side. And I think that, there is one actor in this conflict that already sees us as propaganda of the West. And so this also puts us as humanitarians already, at a loss, because we are only coming in from one side. We are not trying to have that. And I think this issue is starting to be pushed more and more, that we do need to have those conversations. Can we come across the border? Can we try and get into these areas just from the humanitarian side? But I don't know that there's a perfect solution outside of continuing to have a lot of political negotiations around that, unfortunately. And the aid community has to continue to try and push upon that. But I would look to my two colleagues who may have better information than I do on that.
Yeah, maybe I'll come back to you, Dr. Carpenter, because the Human Security Lab, does have a focus on civilian protection, and so, I'm torn between asking you about the assistance part of the response or the protection issues. But let's maybe go to the protection issues. And based on your experience and your expertise, we're all watching the news and we see what's happening. But can you lay out a bit of your priority concerns on this civilian protection piece based on what you've seen and heard from the folks that you've been talking to in Poland?
Yes, thank you. And I would start by saying that assistance and protection may be analytically distinct, but in reality, they are very much part and parcel of the same thing. So again, I'll start by just reiterating the argument that one of the best ways to protect civilians in a conflict zone is to ensure that they can safely flee if they want to. So the US, I listened to the congressional hearing last week on war crimes in Russia as the UN is about to stand up its inquiry into Russian war crimes. And of course, we want Russia to stop committing war crimes. But honestly, one of the things the US can do is follow its own responsibilities under the US Refugee Convention to assist people to flee if they want to protect civilians. That said, many civilians don't want to flee. They want to stay and contribute as they can to the fight, or they cannot flee. And so a lot of the effort, a lot of the requests of those on the border are actually not for volunteers to support the refugees. I mean, you can do some of that too, but it is also to supply the civilians on the other side. And what kind of supplies are they asking for? They're asking for things like basic medical relief, cold weather gear, things that you cannot obtain all of these things in Warsaw. Quite frankly, I was being asked to clear out pharmacies of medical supplies, and I was happy to do that, but I was also being asked for tourniquets, quick clotting bandages, antibiotics, things you can't get in Warsaw without a prescription. And quite frankly, that a volunteer like me who has parachuted into the conflict to do some reporting should not be the primary conduit for bulk supplies of that nature to cross the border. So there's something wrong there when that is the nature of the humanitarian response that these civilians on the other side can get access to, just van loads of pharmaceutical supplies from volunteers. You need a more coherent, coordinated strategy than that. But another and more perhaps disturbing thing, I think perhaps from Maggie's perspective in terms of protecting humanitarian space as well, is that many of those civilians who are in contact with me now and volunteers like me from Lviv saying, here's the supplies we need this week. Please, if you can get someone to drive these from Warsaw. They're asking not just for medicine, they're asking for body armor. They're asking for mechanisms by which civilians can leave their homes in safety and go to the market without getting shot, or by which couriers can feel a little bit safer driving supplies from the border into the cities, or by which doctors can go about in a little bit more safety to patch people up who have been hit by shrapnel. And of course, this is quite a reasonable and understandable request. And it also compromises humanitarian space, because those are essentially, would be perceived as combat gear. These are civilians doing civilian activities, but seeking this kind of protection. So it creates protection dilemmas, in fact. Does that shrink humanitarian space? Does that make it harder to distinguish a civilian from a combatant? And does that then compromise the ability to gather evidence on Russian war crimes? Does it provide plausible deniability? So these are agonizing dilemmas civilians are facing as they try to protect themselves and their own communities, civilians who have stayed behind. And frankly, they would not have to be facing these decisions if the war could be brought to a speedy end. So I am reminded when I look at this situation very much of Bosnia, where for 5 years, between 1991 and 1995, the West did something very similar, which is to sort of stand by and argue about how best the humanitarian agencies can muster a response. And so out of Bosnia, we had a famous phrase, which was the well-fed dead. So we were feeding and sheltering refugees, sometimes even evacuating them, which contributed to the ethnic cleansing. But at the same time, we weren't bringing the war to an end. So they were being kept alive, so they would then be shelled later. And I fear that there is some of that potentially that is going to go on if we concentrate so much on just alleviating the conflict while continuing to allow this war to continue, in which ultimately the responsibility to protect civilians is in the hands of the belligerents, and they're clearly not going to follow that. And in those contexts, if you create a humanitarian corridor, it's not a humanitarian corridor if it is not protected against attack. Protecting it against attack means being willing to engage Russians who attack it militarily. If you're not going to do that, it's perhaps better not to concentrate civilians in a mass in a corridor or in a safe area, because it simply turns them into an easier target. So these are things to consider. I've begun to hear talk about humanitarian intervention, our responsibility to protect, but from Congress people. I don't think it's even necessary to think about the situation in this way. This is not a civil war where a government is repressing its own people, and we need the R2P doctrine as an excuse to go in and violate sovereignty. Sovereignty has been violated. It wouldn't matter if Russia was following the Geneva Conventions to the letter. In war, civilians still are at risk, and civilians are at risk right now because their country is falling apart and they're being displaced. Even if Russia wasn't targeting any civilians, even if they were allowing humanitarian access, this aggressive war is still disastrous for civilians. And aggressive war, violations of the UN Charter, are themselves a crime that warrants a collective response. So we don't even need to think in terms of civilian protection. We could think in terms of the collective responsibility of the international community under the UN Charter. It's not only the NATO treaty to which we owe some allegiance and some concern. There is also a collective right, if not a duty, under the UN Charter to assist Ukraine.
Thanks for that. We've heard quite a bit about myriad challenges in the humanitarian response, the need for supplies, coordination, protection, the challenges in Poland and the neighboring countries in terms of resources. So as we're running short on time, maybe I'll come back to you, Maggie and Lauren, for if you have maybe a final word on, for people watching, viewing, what should we be thinking about as next steps? I mean, Dr. Carpenter laid out a whole lot of them, political, security, and on the humanitarian side. But Maggie, maybe start with you and then come to you, Lauren, for a final thought on what we should be thinking about. What's a recommendation you would want to leave people with?
I mean, the recommendation would be to continue to put pressure on our government for bigger solutions. I think my opening point, and I would very much agree with Charlie, this is getting thrown on the backs of humanitarians. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be running into this situation to provide as much as we can. We are not the solution, and we won't have the solutions, and we won't be able to fill the gaps. And if this is prolonged, it will get worse and worse and worse with regards to what we can do. So the solutions are bigger than what humanitarian the community can provide. And I think that for those listening, that has to be political pressure to those who can come up with those solutions.
Thanks, Maggie. Lauren, a final thought?
A couple pieces. I think first, again, thank you for the panel and hosting this event. I think one is this is a marathon and it's not a sprint. And I think that we're seeing an outpouring of support, for donations and things like this happening, but this is not going to go away anytime soon. I think particularly now that, as we're all saying, as far as needing to have an end to the conflict. So that's one piece. And I think with the advocacy also encouraging, increasing the cap for Ukrainians to be able to be resettled in other countries. We're seeing temporary protected status in the United States, but we also need to be able to open up our doors, and not just the United States, but others within Europe as well. So that would be the ask to take away with this, is that we're seeing the events in Ukraine, we see the neighboring countries, but beyond that, there's a lot of people moving through, and they're going to be needing to be welcomed in a number of locations. So that would be something that I would want everyone to consider and take away.
Well, thank you. Thanks for leaving us with that. I think those are really actionable things that we can take away here, that we need to keep the pressure on. We need to think long term. We need to support the neighboring countries, not just through the UN agencies, but also directly to the civil society organizations, and encourage those governments, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, to support their domestic response capacity. We need to support the civilians who are, under siege, but also the citizens of the neighboring countries who are leading the charge in the response. And we just need to keep the attention focused and think through, getting to an end to the conflict, because the humanitarian response is not the solution here. So let me just say, on behalf of the CSIS Humanitarian Agenda and on behalf of my friend and colleague, Steve Morrison at the CSIS Global Health Security Program, thank you, Lauren Pucci from HIAS, Maggie Fleming from Interaction, and Charlie Carpenter from the Human Security Lab and UMass Amherst, both for the work that you're doing and for joining us today. And of course, thanks very much to Alex Mahoney and the team at USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance for joining us and for supporting this work. And thanks as well to my colleagues at CSIS, Mary and Eric, for helping us put on the program. And finally, thank you all for joining us and watching and sharing with us your thoughts. We look forward to hearing from you. We welcome your feedback on this discussion and on the rest of our work. And we'll continue to, provide that analysis and spotlight on the Ukraine crisis, but also, as Maggie pointed out, on the other humanitarian crises in the world that are happening independent of this and are going to be impacted by this because of the reverberating effects of this particular conflict. So thank you all for joining us today. We wish you a great day and look forward to working with you in the future.